Good afternoon, everyone. Country Flyboy here, and today, the third video in the reading chart tutorial series. Alright, so today we're going to be talking about en route charts, IFR en route charts, the low and high en routes. We'll cover VFR charts on another video. Today we're just going to talk about low en route charts. Now, I don't know how many people in Flight Sim actually make use of the low en route charts. If you don't, you really should, because there's a lot of information on here. So this is a low en route chart. There's two types. There's a low en route and there is a high en route. And the difference between them is altitude, basically. Low en route charts covers surface to 18,000 feet. Low en route IFR, so that's where your Victor Airways, your Tango Airways are. And the high en routes cover 18,000 feet to 45,000 feet. These are your Jet Airways and your Quebec Airways. So the difference in what's shown on them is, like in the high-end routes, only the stuff that applies to aircraft that are going to be 18,000 feet or higher will be shown. So you may see R3008D is shown over here, as well as R2903A and B are shown right here. But if you look at the low en route chart, you can see there is more airspace around them, including MOAs, more restricted areas. They're not shown on the high en route charts because they don't go up that high. So en route charts have no terrain details on them aside from the coastline. You may occasionally find terrain on them if it's important, but most of the time, the only thing you're going to ever see as far as terrain is the coastline. And any airports that have instrument approaches will be shown, and you'll also see important airspace. The main thing we're worried about is the airways, because that's what we're going to be focusing on as we fly. Whenever you're flying IFR, you're going to have a route. There's very rarely are you ever going to see any aircraft flying IFR direct. It just doesn't happen. The only time you could ever really get an IFR direct route is if that was your route. Like if the weather was crap and you just had to relocate the airplane from one airport to the other and it's in the same terminal area. That's the only time you will ever see IFR direct. Now in that situation you may also get what's called a TAC route, which is terminal area routes, which are preset IFR routes. You can actually get these and you can just show up at the airport, call clearance and request them. You don't have to file a flight plan to get a TAC route. They don't really exist too much on the East Coast. SoCal has them a lot, so if you fly on Pilot Edge, you could very easily get a TAC route. But there's not too many that I know of, if any at all, in Florida on the East Coast where I do most of my flying. So TAC routes just not a thing really. And the reason that they are not prevalent on the East Coast, especially in Florida, is well, the terrain is, as you can see from these numbers here. These are the off-route obstacle clearance altitude, this brown number, this 34 with the small 4. So if you look how the chart is divided up into grids via the latitude and longitude lines, see right there? Somewhere inside that grid is going to be the off-route obstacle clearance altitude, which will be a brown number, and it will be a big digit and a small digit. The small digit is hundreds of feet, big digit's thousands of feet. So in this grid right here, if we fly at 2,000 feet or higher, we won't hit anything. We're guaranteed to not hit anything if we fly at least 2,000 feet in that grid. That's important because if you were to fly direct between two waypoints, you have to be at least that high. Versus if you're on an airway, you could get lower. So let's talk about the different things that we see. The symbology for nav aids is pretty similar to VFR charts. So that's an NDB there. Here we see a VOR. We see the airways are more prominent on the en route charts because they're more important. You don't really see them too much on the VFR chart. Or you see them on VFR charts, but they're not as prominent. Here they are very prominent. And we also see the airspace that implies that would be important, as well as MTRs. So let's. I want to point something out. You may see on en route charts, as well as SIDS, stars, and approaches, thick, bold lines and thin lines, smaller lines. How do you know which one is a route that you could fly on the chart? Say, like, if we wanted to go from Waycross to Habel, and we wanted to use the airways to do it, if we were up on Victor 157 traveling northbound, and we get the Waycross, can we go straight to Habel on the 078 radial outbound from Waycross? No, we cannot. Not unless ATC clears us for that. The reason being is because that is not a flyable route. And how do I know it's not a flyable route? Well, the first thing is it's a thin line. That's the first indication that this is something other than a flyable route. And you may also see these on instrument approach charts as well as SIDS and stars. You see these radials coming from Craig here. Only one of them is flyable, and these are transitions, this one here. These others are just for navigation purposes. That way, you know, if you have the localizer here tuned on nav 1 and Craig VOR on nav 2, when you cross the nav 2 radial 302, you know you have passed BERT. So when you're on the localizer and your other CDI indicates that you're passing radial 302 from Craig, then you know you have passed BERT. And the same thing applies to the IFR charts. So we know we have, when we're on either Victor 267 here or Victor 362, we know we've reached Habel when we've passed the 078 radial from Waycross. The way we know it's not a flyable route is there's no altitude associated with it. There's a course, and if you look back here, there's courses for all these, but only one of them has an altitude. It also has a distance. It might not always, though. Only one of them has an altitude. And whenever the leg you're looking at has an altitude associated with it, in this case it's a minimum en-route altitude, then you know that it's a flyable route. You can safely fly it. And any flyable route's going to have a minimum en route altitude because they want to make sure you don't hit nothing whilst on that route. What about this? We see 3 altitudes here. Well, one is the minimum en route altitude. It's the number on top. There's the minimum en route altitude. That's the lowest altitude you can go to. And that altitude is set to provide not just terrain and obstacle clearance, but also nav aid and comm radio reception. If you're on this airway above 10,000, you're guaranteed to be able to receive the VORs, the Alma and Brunswick VOR, as well as the Waycross VOR since it's associated with it here. However, there's other altitudes. This blue one here, I'm not 100% sure. I think that may be... Oh, I think that may be GPS. If it's saying the minimum en-route altitude for this airway, if you are RNAV equipped, is 3,000. So if you're not RNAV equipped and you're using the VORs, it's 10,000 because you need to be able to receive both of them. But if you are RNAV equipped, you don't need to be able to receive both VFRs, so you can just be at 3,000. That's what that blue one's for. What about this third one here? The 1700 has an asterisk next to it. That one is for terrain clearance. What it's saying here is 1700 is the lowest you can fly and still be clear terrain. But you cannot receive nav aid. You won't get nav aid reception with that. So the minimum en-route altitude for this airway, the stretch of airway between Alma and Brunswick, is 10,000 feet for both terrain clearance and nav aid reception, 3,000 feet if you're RNAV equipped, and 1,700 feet if all you care about is terrain separation. So you're guaranteed that if you're flying 700 feet along or 1,700 feet along this airway, you won't hit anything. And if you're above 10,000, not only will you not hit anything, you will receive both VORs along this stretch. Now, real quick, I want to talk about airways. Airways are nothing more than straight lines between VORs or the point of intersect of two VORs. So if you look here at Victor 362 that we've been using, all it is a straight line between, this section of it here is a straight line between Alma VOR and Brunswick VOR. That's it. It's got some waypoints on it, but it doesn't necessarily have to. They could get rid of both Habel and BERT here if they wanted to. And it would still be a good airway. However, I also note that it's not just straight lines between VORs. It could also be the straight line between the point of intersect of two VORs. Case in point, airway Victor 3 from Brunswick and goes all the way up, as soon as it loads up, to Savannah up here. But note, it doesn't go straight to Savannah. It actually, Victor 3 runs all the way up to Keller, where it intersects with Victor 437 and then goes to Savannah. So if you were flying this, what you would do is you'd have VOR number 1 on Brunswick and the 018 radial outbound. So you're on the Airway. And then when you would have Savannah on the 183 radial inbound on nav 2, and when you see that radial come in, you turn and start flying it. You know you're at Keller, and fly to Savannah. And then from here, from Keller to Savannah, Victor 3, Victor 37, Victor 437, and Victor 441 are all on the same line. They split back off at Savannah, though. So that's important to note. Once you get close to Keller, be on the lookout for other airplanes. Not really, because you're IFR, ATC is going to be separating you. What about this squiggly line right here? Well, the squiggly line indicates that for some reason that route is not flyable. So, for some reason, Victor 154 between Dublin and Lotz is not flyable. Don't know why, but for some reason it's not. So, whilst you still could fly that route for direct from Dublin to Lotz, you can't use the Airway there. You'd have to go direct between the two, which means you'd have to use this as your minimum altitude, 2,500. Once you hit Lotz, you're good to go. You're back on the Airway. But for some reason, Victor 154 is not flyable between Dublin and Lotz. And there may be other notations as well on the chart. As you can see, here's Victor 362 between, I believe that's Macon, oh no, that's Vienna. The Vienna VOR and the Alma VOR, and we have a notation here. Radial 309, unusable, use Vienna, radial 127. So for some reason, we would have to track Vienna VOR on this whole airway. Normally, you track on an airway to a certain point with one VOR and then switch to the other, but for some reason, we have to use the 127 radial outbound from Vienna all the way to Alma. We can't use the 309 inbound because it's unusable. It says it's unusable. Don't know why, don't care why. They say we can't use it. We're not going to use it. So I just mentioned that airways are straight lines between VORs, and at some point you need to switch between using one VOR and using the other. So let me bring back up the flight plan thing real quick, and let's just plan from Alma to Craig. So there. Alright, so we're on Victor 5-1, and we're going to be above 5,000 feet for both nav aid reception. How do I know if I'm tracking when to switch from using the Alma VOR for navigation to using the Craig VOR for navigation? I would use the halfway point. As you can see in this little box right here, 88. That means the stretch of airway between these two VORs, not including these intersections here, is 88 miles. So if you did the math, you see it's 61 miles from Alma to Crissa, and then 27 miles from Crissa to Craig. You add that together, you get 88. So there. 88 in half of 88 is 44. So 44 DME from the Alma VOR. You will also be 44 DME from the Craig VOR. That's when you would switch to using the other VOR. Unless you see this little symbol right here. You see we have sort of a straight-lined S form as soon as that grid loads. It's always the one you need is the one that doesn't load. See how we have this straight-lined S kind of formed here? That indicates the changeover point. Changeover points are always halfway between the two VORs on the airway, or they're at the intersection where the radial changes. So if I could find it, there's one right here. Hortar right here. You can see there's a course change happening. Well, so we would track from the Savannah VOR, if we were traveling along Victor 437, all the way to Hortar, and then we'd have to switch to using the St. Augustine. Is it St. Augustine? No, it goes down to Ormond Beach. Then we'd have to switch to tracking inbound on the Ormond Beach VOR once we reached Hortar because of the course change. So there's no doing math on that leg. And you may notice there's no big sections published like we saw over here with that number in the square telling you the total distance between the two VORs, because your changeover point is going to be Hortar. This is sort of the same thing. This indicates that this is where you need to change over. So in the absence of this mark, or in the absence of a course change, you would use halfway between the two VORs. So 88 miles, we change over at 44. But for some reason, probably because the Alma VOR has got limited range, we have to change over from using the Alma to the Craig VOR at 40 DME from Alma, which is 48 DME from Craig. That's when we have to switch over, not 44, 40. So, yeah, if we're tracking along Victor 243 between Waycross and Craig, then the total distance between those two VORs is 78 miles. Let me bring out the calculator because I'm not about to do that math in my head. So 78 miles, half of 78 miles is 39. So at 39 DME from Waycross, we switch to 39. We switch to using Craig, and we 39 DME from it. But if we weren't flying that, if we were flying straight from Alma to Craig, what did I just do? There. We would have to use this changeover point, or if we were over here, Hortar is our changeover point. Alrighty. And the rest of this is pretty obvious stuff. You can see the Airway Victor 243 is on the Waycross radio 136 outbound. It's got the number there, 136, and it's heading away from, depending on which way you're tracking, heading inbound or outbound, you'd have to figure it out. 136, if we were tracking on this Airway to Waycross, we would have to just make sure I get the number right. We would have to use radial 316 to Waycross, or if we were tracking outbound, we use radial 136. Or if you have an HSI, just set radial 136 and it'll tell you. And that's why HSIs are better. And here's another notation. Man, the Alma VOR's got all sorts of usage limitations, don't it? You can see here, radial 144 not available below 10,000 feet. So nav-aid reception for this airway is 5,000 feet, but if we want to use radial 144, we got to be higher than 10,000 feet. Yeah, I don't know. Crazy stuff. So, the en route charts provide you a lot of information. Now, if at any time you ever need to know something, just get a legend. You can Google search FAA IFR en route chart legend. This one here's the fourth link down that I found. This is a really good one. It's the complete legend for en route charts, both high and low. So if you ever have a question as to what something is, get a legend. It tells you, these are actually printed on the charts in real life, so you don't have to guess. They don't want you guessing, they want you to know it. So that's why they have the legends. In case you ever forget something, it's there. Now, one reason I want to stress using en route charts is they tell you what frequency to use in a certain area. So if you see this little box right here with the zipper outline, so this indicates that Jacksonville Center is on 125.375 for the Lake City area. So this area is the Lake City section of Jacksonville Center. So in this area, is it divided off by grid? No. So anywhere when we're close to Lake City, we know Jacksonville Center is on 125.375. Versus if we're over here near Perry, it's 127.8. So this box will tell you the frequency you need to be on. And if we zoom all the way back up to the north, we see this same symbol, but it's not in a box. It's in just a zipper line going over the place. That's the fear. That is the border between Jacksonville Center and Atlanta Center. So we know if we were flying IFR, both online or off, we know somewhere along Victor 5-1 before we hit Dublin, we're going to be told to switch over from Jacksonville to Atlanta. And it should have the frequency somewhere nearby. Millen, Columbus. We're sort of halfway in between the two. We could get either one. I'm guessing we're going to get the Millen frequency, which is 127.9 or 5. This is mostly for if you don't already know who to talk to. So yeah, in real life, ATC is going to be handing you off from one controller to the other, giving you the frequency. So it could be either one of these. It may not be none of them. It could be something else entirely. But if you don't know who to talk to, if you just took off or you ran or something happened, you know you can reach somebody in this area on that frequency. Conversely, they don't show TRACON frequencies on here, but the VFR charts do. The VFR charts will give you the TRACON frequencies. What about these en route high charts? Well, as we mentioned earlier, the en route high charts are about the same, except they only show things that apply for above 18,000 feet. So if it's not above 18,000 feet, it's not going to get shown here on the en route charts, aside from the airports. All right, so obviously we see the jet airways now, because Victor Airways are the maximum altitude for a Victor Airway is 18,000 feet. That's implied. Yes, Airways can have a maximum altitude as well. For Victor Airways, it's 18,000 feet unless otherwise noted. And for Jet Airways, it's 45,000 feet unless otherwise noted. So once you get above 18,000, you're going to be using Jet Airways, not Victors. You may, and how do you know it's noted? Well, this airway here, this RNAV airway, Tango 204, Blue Airways are RNAV airways, not so. You cannot fly these airways if all you have is VOR. So if you wanted to go between the Taylor VOR and the Brunswick VOR, if you were RNAV capable, say you had an FMS or a GPS, then you could use Tango 204, in which case your minimum en route altitude is 2,100. And note it has that G there, like this one here, meaning if you are RNAV capable, then 2,100 is the highest, is the lowest you can go. And that's important because that doesn't mean we would have NavAid reception. We may not have the Brunswick VOR once we are at 33 miles, which is the halfway point to the changeover. Because it's an RNAV airway, we'll be using RNAV equipment, so we don't need to use the VORs. It's a good idea to have them set as a backup, but you don't need to do it. But we also see it has a maximum, MAA-15000. If it has MAA-, that is maximum altitude for the airway. So the lowest we can go for Tango 204 is 2,100. The highest we can go is 15,000. If we didn't have RNAV equipment, we couldn't use the RNAV airway, and this is the route we would have to take to fly between those two VORs. We would have to go from Taylor, track 096 outbound to Mona. Then there's a course change. Actually, there's a whole airway change. We would have to go on the 227 radial inbound to Brunswick. So, yeah, there's that. Back to the high en route charts, since I got distracted. Let me clear this. So, yep, Blue Airways are the RNAV airways. High en route charts will show the Jet Airways. They may not have a minimum en route altitude published on the Jet Airways, because the minimum en route altitude for a Jet Airway is 18,000 feet unless otherwise noted. So if there is an en route altitude published for a Jet Airway, like we see right here, MEA 2400, that's different. That's not 18,000 feet. That means if we're going to use Juliet 91, we have to be 24,000 feet or higher. Hello everyone, Country Flyboy and Editing here. So I'm editing this video right now, and I see there's something I forgot to mention about the high en route charts. If you look right there, just to the left of the Taylor VOR, Juliet 91 and Juliet 89, so J91, J89, you may notice that the normal square black box that depicts, that names an airway, You may notice it forms an arrow on J91 and J89. And what that means is that is a one-direction airway. So normally an airway is bidirectional. You can go either direction on that airway. But if you see that arrow, that means it is one direction only. One-way street, basically. You can only go in the direction that the arrow is pointing. So just wanted to mention that real quick. When you see that arrow, that is a one-direction airway. You can only go in the direction it's pointing. All right, so sorry to interrupt you. Back to the video. Now, what about here? We see on Juliet 89, there's a 1100 to 0300 Zulu. That means that that airway is only usable between those times. So the airway Juliet 89 between Valdosta and Hitter is only usable for between 1100 Zulu and 0300 Zulu. And other than that, they're really the same as the low en route charts. So we see there's airports all in this area right here. Here's Waycross. Folkestone's airfield would be right here. Hilliard's airfield would be right here. They're not shown because they don't have instrument approaches. Their runway is not long enough to be shown on an en route chart, and they don't have instrument approaches. Herlong wouldn't be shown on the en route chart if it didn't have an instrument approach. That's Herlong right there. It's not shown on the high en route chart, I've just noticed, but it is shown, or should be shown, yeah, right there on the low en route chart. There's Herlong Recreational. If we switch back to the high, it's not shown. So, yes, Herlong doesn't have a runway long enough to show up on this chart, but since it has instrument approaches, then it is printed. And you might be asking, what are these brown airways right here? We're on the low en route chart, so this brown airway, if we look it up, that is an oceanic route. So from the Dennis NDB to Jaws is the AR5 oceanic route. It goes to Trout, which is somewhere. Not sure where. But right here, and you can see from this point on, it starts drawing it as a standard airway, RNAV Airways. And we could go all the way, yeah, it goes all the way to Trout, at which point you would start using a North Atlantic track, or you'd start using longitude and latitude waypoints in your flight plan. So if you were an international aircraft departing Jacksonville, you would get vectored onto the AR5 oceanic route airway until you hit Trout, at which point you're using the tracks, or you're using longitude, latitude waypoints. Now, if we go up to the high en route chart, we see the same thing. AR5, we see it excludes the airspace above flight level 430 outside the U.S. So at some point, I'm not sure where, but you would get on oceanic control at some point here. Yes, right there, Atlantic high control. So about the time you hit Trout, that's where Jacksonville Center is no longer going to be able to control you. You would switch over to oceanic control at Trout, and that's where you start using the oceanic procedures. New York Oceanic, Kilo Zulu Whiskey Yankee. And there's the continuous US ADAs, Air Defense Identification Zone. Alright, so I really don't know what else to cover. There's a lot of info on these charts, and I highly encourage you to use them. They are very, very useful. I'm not sure how often people in the flight sim world make use of the en route charts, especially the low en route charts. They're very, very useful things to have. So, yep, that was me teaching you sort of how to read low en route charts. I said this series was going to be boring, but yep, that's basically how it's done. Next video, we'll be talking about stars. Now, one thing One thing I want to mention before we close out the video is back to the minimum en route altitudes. As you can see along Victor 362, the minimum en route altitude between Havel and Brunswick is 3,000 feet, but between Havel and Alma, it's 10,000 feet. How would we know that? How would we know that the minimum en route altitude changes on this stretch of airway if we didn't know Havel was there? And the reason is, you see these little lines that stop short of Havel? If you look at every other waypoint, the lines stop short, but it's implied that they go through them. It's implied that this line goes through Wywe here. Why does this one have a barb on it that stops it short of Havel? Well, this airway still makes use of Havel, but that barb means that there is a different minimum en route altitude between each side of Havel. Now, these barbs are implied at VORs, so they're not drawn at VORs because they're implied. Anytime you hit a VOR, you're going to see a new minimum en route altitude. And you can tell this because if you look at every other airway, let me find an example. Here, Victor 243, it's 3,000 between Craig and Waycross, but it's 2,300 between Waycross and Vienna. And how I know that there's no barbs drawn is because it's implied at the VORs. So when you see this mark here, you see the airway stop short with this little barb that cuts it off, you know the minimum en route altitude is changing. So if we are flying from Brunswick to Alma on this airway, at some point prior to Havel, we need to climb up to 10,000 feet. And it even says it right here, Havel, Victor 362, 10,000 northwest bound. So if we're northwest bound on Victor 362, we need to cross Havel at or above 10,000 feet. So like I said, there's lots of information that you really need to use the en route charts, is all I'm saying. And another thing I want to stress is the symbology on charts, both for SIDS, stars, and approaches and en routes, is all the same. As you can see on this star here, the symbology is the same. On this approach, the symbology is the same. That's done for a reason. Everything's the same between these charts, so basically you learn how to read one, you learn how to pretty much read all of them. It's a little bit different with en route charts because a lot of times this stuff's not in a secret code. There's no secret code you have to learn to read this. It tells you exactly what it is right on the chart. And there's a reason they do that. There's no secret code because they don't want you forgetting anything. You read one chart, it's all standard, you can read them all. So that was en route charts. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.